Okay, everyone. So we talked about public records and recording, and now we're going to get into some information on this request for proposal. So let's do it. Okay, so section basics, we did that. Agenda overview, we're going to talk about the Office of Labor Standards a little bit, the labor standards specifically that may impact domestic workers, the Domestic Workers Standards Board, why this campaign and what we're looking for, the application process, and then also the question and answer period. And if you see me looking off to the sides, because I'm looking at the presentation and maybe looking at some of my notes. So, all right, Office of Labor Standards. So our mission at the office is to advance labor standards through community and business engagement, strategic enforcement, which means working with employers and workers to try to get businesses to follow the labor standards, and innovative policy development. So we have a policy team, works on policies, looks into what might be most helpful to workers and employers. And then we also have a commitment to race and social justice. So that's something that we incorporate in all of our work. The Domestic Workers Standards Board is a very special part of our Domestic Workers Ordinance. The board was created by the Domestic Workers Ordinance, and it's a meeting that happens every month. They also do a lot more work, but the board itself provides a space for hiring entities. So people who hire domestic workers themselves, worker organizations, and anyone from the public to consider, analyze, and recommend possible legal protections, more labor standards, and funding to improve the working conditions for domestic workers in the city of Seattle. The Domestic Workers Standards Board did help us get this funding allocation for this request for proposal. On to the labor standards. So the city has many labor standards. Some of them may cover domestic workers. Of course, all domestic workers are covered by the Domestic Worker Ordinance. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. And then we have a lot of labor ordinances that specifically cover employees. So in some situations, domestic workers are employees, whether they work for a business or in some situations, working for a private family, you can still have an employment relationship there. So if domestic workers are employees, then they should receive all of the protections that any other employee in Seattle would receive, including paid sick and safe time, the minimum wage, which is already part of the Domestic Workers Ordinance, protections against wage theft, fair chance employment, which is about the ability for people who have criminal records to apply and receive jobs, and then commuter benefits, which is our ordinance about businesses who have more than 20 employees have to offer a commuter benefit to their employees. We also have ordinances that specifically cover workers who are not employees. And so that would be our independent contractors protections. So that one, as the name implies, is specific to independent contractors who are working with other businesses. So people who own their own business and don't have any employees, but they're working with other businesses. And then our suite of app-based worker ordinances, which include the app-based worker minimum payment ordinance. Basically, app-based workers need to be paid at least a minimum for any of the work they do for app-based platforms. App-based worker paid sick and safe time. So like the employee paid sick and safe time just means app-based workers are entitled to a certain amount of paid sick time and safe time that they can take off. And then our newest ordinance is the app-based worker deactivation rights ordinance, and that one is about what companies have to do before removing a worker from their app platform and basically firing them if they were employees. Get those, and the app-based worker ordinances could certainly cover domestic workers, particularly domestic workers who are doing that domestic work through an application. So think about nannies or your tasks. Different apps have kind of different coverage, but domestic workers may be covered under those ordinances. So why this contract? What are we doing? The purpose of this contract is that we want to educate domestic worker hiring entity employers. So that's a very specific thing. It means people who hire domestic workers and also have an employment relationship with those domestic workers. So we want to do specific outreach and education to those hiring entity employers who are covered by Seattle's paid sick and safe time ordinance. Because if you employ a domestic worker, you're an employer, therefore you must follow the paid sick and safe time ordinance. And that would require those employers to provide domestic worker employees with paid sick and safe time benefits. And domestic workers often don't have access to these benefits because of the type of relationships they have with the people who hire them, but they should be entitled to that time if they are employees, and we want domestic workers to be able to access those benefits. So yes, the purpose of this contract is to increase awareness of those domestic worker hiring entity employers, to develop and share materials with those employers, and then also to assist employers with employee classification. And basically what that means is that some employers don't know that they're employers, especially in this context of domestic workers. So we want the organization who is awarded this contract to help people who maybe don't know that they're employers with figuring out that they are employers and properly classifying the domestic workers that they're hiring as employees, because that means they're entitled to benefits like paid sick and safe time. So why hiring entity employers? Kind of already went into this, but a lot of it is because domestic workers are very vulnerable to workplace violations. They're entitled to paid sick and safe time, but they don't receive it because the people who hire them either don't understand that they need to be providing their employees with paid sick and safe time, or they just don't think they should have to. And either way, if a domestic worker is an employee, they are entitled to these things. And so we want to do outreach to the people who are employing them to make sure that they get those benefits. As it says, households, they just might not understand that they're employers. We want to do specific outreach so that they do understand that they're employers and what that means for them. We also want to really just dial in on that difference between hiring independent contractors and hiring employees, because there is a lot of confusion there. Independent contractors and employees have different sets of rights. And so we want to do more outreach and education to hiring entities so that they can understand, am I an employer or am I hiring an independent contractor? What does that mean either way? And a lot of this is kind of to do upstream work because domestic workers are so vulnerable. Certainly we can do outreach and education to domestic workers, but if their employers either don't understand or refuse to understand that they are hiring employees, domestic workers are at a lot of risk of retaliation for standing up to their rights, and risking their jobs because they might just be working for one or two families. If you talk to that family and they fire you, you've lost your source of income. So we just kind of want to do that upstream work of talking to the entities that are hiring domestic workers as employees so that the domestic workers don't have to do that work themselves of proactively going after or asking for their rights to be respected. What might a consultant do under this contract? There's a lot of things that a consultant could do. These are just a few examples. We are definitely looking for other creative ways of doing outreach and education. And so please, don't just take these things and say, okay, this is what they want, this is what we're going to put in the application. Really think about what your strengths are and what you could do to do outreach and education. But examples of what people, consultants, and outreach staff have done in the past: door-to-door outreach to homes where domestic workers might be employed, workshops and trainings for domestic worker hiring entities and employers, and then community capacity building. And what that really means is training people in the community so that they can then go out and then train the people that they know, and it just kind of cascades from there. So that community capacity building is about teaching people, making sure they understand what the obligations and the rights are, and then making them comfortable, giving them the experience they need to go out and share that information. But yes, there are lots of other ways to do outreach and education. And so please put the ways that you want to do outreach and education in your application. We are accepting applications from organizations outside of Seattle, which is not something we used to do, but organizations outside Seattle must be able to show that the focus population hires or employs domestic workers within the city boundaries, because outside the city boundaries, there is no domestic worker ordinance, or Seattle labor standards do not apply outside of the boundaries of the city of Seattle. So your organization can be outside of the city. You just have to be able to show that the hiring entity employers that you're talking to are inside of the city. The timeline for this RFP, it is available in all of the documents, but I'm just going to repeat it here. So you can send in questions about this process to me at OLS_RFP@seattle.gov. I will be answering those questions. And what I'll do is answer the questions, and then I'll post both the questions and the answers on our website so that everybody has access to the same information. But there is a deadline for questions because everyone does have to have access to the same information before they submit their application. And so I'm asking folks to send me their questions by 3 p.m. on Monday, October 21st, so that I can answer them and post them to the website before the applications are actually due. And that way everybody has access to that information if they want it. People are certainly welcome to send in their applications before the deadline. You can do that. You'll just miss out on potential answers to questions that others have asked. Speaking of application submission, the applications are due by 5 p.m. on Friday, October 25th, and you would send the application, all the required materials, to OLS_RFP@seattle.gov. Once you do that, send in your application, I will send you a link to book an optional presentation, and those would be for 30-minute time slots between October 28th and November 1st. We'll send you a link and you can schedule when you want that presentation to happen. It is optional. You do not have to do a presentation. You don't get any extra points for doing a presentation. I think one of the main reasons that we offer this is sometimes folks have a better time explaining what they're going to do verbally rather than doing it in writing. And so we do want to offer people the option to do that, but it will not, you don't get like plus 10 points for doing a presentation. It's just a way for you to give us more information about your proposal. What do you need to submit? Okay, there's a long list. There's a checklist on the website and in the actual RFP request for proposal document itself. So you need to submit a cover page, which explains like who you are, what your organization is, gives some information about, tax ID, things like that, and talks about what the application is. Then we have the application questions themselves. So it's a separate document, but it's just questions about like, what are you going to do? Tell us about the populations that you work with, the communities that you work with, and give us some information about your plans for what you would do under this contract. And some of that information can be quite detailed, like, we want to do these 4 events over this period of time, things like that. That's part of the application questions. The proposed budget is an Excel sheet. It just gets into like, how much do you think you're going to be spending over this contract period, which I think I did not mention this before, but it's intended to be about 6 months. So we would like to execute these contracts in December and have work start, and then have the contract go for about 6 months. So your proposed budget for what you're going to do over that time, whether that's staff, materials, it can get quite detailed, but just what are you going to spend this money on? We have a consultant questionnaire that's like a city form that all consultants have to fill out, and it just asks questions about, again, who are you? What is your relationship to the city? Do you have any issues with like your licensing, anything like that? We do, or in order to get paid, you have to have a City of Seattle business license. So we're just requesting that upfront to make sure that everything will be all good once we execute the contract. Proof of legal business name, same thing. You have to be a legal entity operating in the state. And so we want proof of that so that we can have contracting go smoothly and make sure you get paid. The last thing is optional. It's not a requirement. You do not have to send it in, but it's called contract exceptions. And what that means is there's like a template contract that we use in the city when we're hiring consultants. And if you do not want some of the terms of that contract when we're doing the kind of final contracting, as part of your application, you need to send contract exceptions, which means like you take the template that's available and you could cross things out, make suggestions, changes. If you do not send those contract exceptions, we will just use the template city contract as we're required to. In contracting, we can definitely talk about like, how much are you doing? How much are you going to get paid? Like, what do you have to send us in order to get paid? Those types of things. The boilerplate, I'll just say the template is more about like, these are the requirements for working with the city. Here are all the things that you need to have as part of your organization. Here's how we set up payment, stuff like that. And so if you do not want any of those items in there, you would have to send contract exceptions. So cross them out and send them back with your application. Great. Talked about this a little bit, but submitting questions, getting responses. So please send your questions to me at ols_RFP@seattle.gov. You can also call and ask your questions, ask for a Meredith, and they'll write a message for me and send it to me. Or you can ask to be transferred to me and leave a message, and I will respond to you either by calling you or sending you an email. Same thing, I will respond directly, try to help you, and then I will post all of the questions and my responses to our website so that everybody has access to the same information. All right, how are proposals going to be evaluated? So in an RFP process at the city, what we do is we get together an evaluation committee. And so that is a group of people. Some of them are city employees, some of them might not be, but it's a group of people who we've gathered who are outside of the Office of Labor Standards, but have experience in this subject matter to read over the applications, watch any optional presentations, and then evaluate them. So score them in some way, discuss them. They have a rubric or a points rubric that our office has made to kind of direct them in how to score presentations. So hopefully everybody is kind of on the same page and we don't have like really high numbers and some really low numbers for the same item. But they'll score them. We'll get together as an evaluation committee, discuss the applications, and then come up with like a final score, a final plan for who the evaluation committee thinks should be funded. And so that's that final determination. And the points rubric or how they're supposed to score, what information that they're supposed to use to score the applications is available in the RFP guideline document. If you go to page 11, starts there and then goes down to page 13. So these are the criteria that we're using to rate the applications. And it's in 4 main subject areas. So who are you? Who's the organization? We want a clear description of the organization and discussion of the race and social justice framework that you use. Who are you is also about, do you have capacity to be a consultant for the city? And some of that means like the consultant has to be able to process and submit invoices and reports timely, which means just like in the schedule that we've outlined in the request for proposal. So you need to have somebody who is able to do that. That's a requirement that we have as part of this request for proposal. And I think if you look in the RFP, you can see what those reporting requirements will be so that you're not kind of shocked when you're like, oh, I have to, submit these invoices, send these reports. So we're asking for a bi-monthly, so every 2 months invoice, a quantitative data report, which basically just shows like, here's what we did. in numbers, verification for some of your activities. So if one of your activities that you proposed is like a door-to-door campaign, verification might be like, oh, you documented, like, we went on this day, this is how many people we talked to, this is kind of the result of the activity. Copies of the materials used or developed as part of the work plan, that might be if you make a social media post, we probably want that social media post to verify that it happened. And then one of the other reporting requirements is every 90 days, so twice over this contract period, a narrative report. So instead of just the numbers, we want kind of like a explanation in writing of how it's going. And there are specific questions that we've asked. So that's kind of the reporting and invoicing requirements. If you want to see examples of the reports and the invoices, you can go on our website. They're available if you scroll down on the RFP page and just click on the link that says attachment E, sample reports, so that you can see like what it is that you would need somebody to be filling out and if you have capacity to do that. We also, makes sense, want consultants to have knowledge about the world of domestic work in order to receive this funding. So who are you? And that section is worth a total of 40 points. You can see the breakdown in the RFP itself of like what would be a high score, what would be a medium score, and what would be a low score out of those points, and what questions we're asking to get to those scores. So who will benefit is the second category. We want to know, again, does this organization have connections to domestic workers and hiring entity employers? Are employers going to benefit with new knowledge, or domestic workers going to benefit because they're now working in a kind of zone where their rights are more known and respected? So who will benefit? It's like, do you have those connections? Do you have a clear idea of how to increase hiring entity employer knowledge of their obligations? How are you going to do it? And then experience doing technical education with hiring entities and employers. The experience does not have to be about labor standards specifically, just like, have you done work like this with employers in the past? And it, again, doesn't have to historically have been about labor standards, just like any sort of technical education. And you are not penalized for not having worked with our office in the past. So that's not part of the scoring. And that category is worth 30 points. And then next, what do you want to do? So just more detailed, like write out a scope of work that covers the contract period. What are you doing? Like, what is your plan? The work plan also needs to be, so you have the scope of work, like here are the main activities that we're going to do. And then a realistic work plan is like, what action steps are we going to take in order to do this larger scope of work? The budget is also part of this section. So the budget, we want to see like, does what you're planning on spending match up with what you're planning on doing? And that section is worth 30 points. And then the last section is, how will it make a difference and how do you know? So for that section, we're looking for organizations to identify the needs of the community that they're going to do outreach to, and then the barriers to doing outreach and education, or the barriers for those folks to get educated. And that those barriers, it might be time, it might be space. You just want to identify, like, what are those needs? What are those barriers? How are you going to address those needs and barriers? And then how are you planning as an organization to collect data to assess that impact? Like, the work is great. We want the work to be done. We also want to know how it went. Like, how did it work? Was it successful? And that is just to help us and future organizations inform us on what we're doing when we're doing outreach and education to hiring entity employers. And that section is worth 10 points. You can take a look again in the RFP guidelines and see more detailed breakdown of how that scoring will happen, or how we're directing the evaluation committee to score these proposals. Okay, so after selection, what do partners have to do for OLS? So we have to negotiate the contract. And that means likely working with me or one of my colleagues to look at that template contract, add in what specifically you're going to do, how we're going to verify it, those types of things. So we'll negotiate the contract, and we are looking to get this contract executed by December. So that means everybody signs it in early December so that the work can start. I kind of discussed this already, but meetings, so bi-monthly every 2 months, one-on-one with contract manager. So whoever is in charge of that, you'll meet with them. And those meetings are really just to say, how are things going? Do you need support? You know, are there barriers that we can help you with? Or do you have questions, especially about reporting or invoicing? Like, are there issues? Just a time for us to get together and discuss what's going on with the contract. And as I said before, timely submission of invoices and reports, because that is how we track that things are getting done and to what degree, which is helpful when we're asking for funding in the future, when we need to explain like what has the office been doing. That's why we collect that data. Okay. What do the contract and reporting documents look like? So I already discussed this, but if you go to the website, and I apologize because this bottom part is not correct, download the terms and procedures PDF view. That's not correct. You can download the terms and procedures PDF, and that will go into like more detail about what it's like to work with the city. But the contract and reporting documents are on the funding page of the OLS website. And if you just go to funding, domestic worker hiring entity, employer outreach and education, and then scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see the link that says attachment E, sample reporting documents. And those will all be available for you to look at. You are welcome to ask me questions about that, either by calling or writing in. And I am going to put this in the chat. All right, give me 1 second here. Please contact me if you have questions. And yeah, now we'll get into the question and answer period, but I am going to just a second. Okay, so I got a question in the chat about if you need to be a 501c3 in order to apply for this funding, or do you have to be a nonprofit in order to apply for this funding? The answer is no, you do not, but you do need to have your City of Seattle business license. All of the, like, you have to be up on your taxes, all those types of things in order to apply, but no, you do not have to be a nonprofit. Okay. Seeing if there are any more questions. I don't think so. And so given that there are no more questions, I am going to stop recording. I will again post this to the website, and it will be available with all of the other information about the RFP. Okay, thank you everyone for joining, and yeah, please reach out to me if you have any further questions. I'm happy to talk to you either on email or on the phone. And again, this is the contact information that you use for this process. And it's not my personal email, just so that we can all track the questions and kind of make sure that everything's being answered, nothing's getting lost. All right, thank you so much.